To begin this presentation, we would like to thank you for joining us today for our Grief Sensitivity Virtual Learning Institute. This is the third part of a two-part series institute. The focus of this institute is to support those individuals experiencing grief and loss during COVID-19 and beyond. We are so glad that you're here with us today. My name is Angel Casillas, and I am the project manager for the National Hispanic and Latino Mental Health Technology Transfer Center based on Bayamón, Puerto Rico. I am pleased to be your host in this conference session, and I am pleased to introduce this session entitled Pandemia, Restoring the Wounded Soul, Latino Reflections on Loss, Grief, and Rituals. I want to thank our wonderful speakers for being here with us today, and a big thanks to all of you for joining us. We truly hope you find today's presentation engaging, helpful, in your work. Before we continue or to start off, we would like to cover a few housekeeping items. We have made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will follow up using your registration information. All attendees are muted and cannot share video. If you have a question for the presenter, please direct yourself to the Q&A pod at the lower end of your screen. If you have a comment or link for all attendees, please use the chat box for that. The session is recorded and the slide decks will be posted on our website. If you attend at least half of the session, you will receive an email following the presentation on how to access your certificate of attendance. This event is captioned. To view captions, click on the arrow beside the CC box at the bottom of your screen and choose Show Subtitles. To change the size of the subtitle, click on the arrow next to the CC box and choose Subtitle Settings, where you'll find the option of making the subtitles larger or smaller. And if you don't already, please follow us on social media and stay in touch with us. There you can find lots of information regarding mental health and products we share constantly. Some additional information: we just released a series of fact sheets focused on addressing various grief-related topics. Please also check our Responding to COVID-19 Grief and Loss and Bereavement webpage for more MHCTC events and resources. You can see that on the page. Before we move forward, we would like to recognize that participating in this and our other sessions may activate your own grief and feelings of loss. As mental health care providers, we also need to care for ourselves. Please monitor yourself and practice good self-care, including taking breaks, stretching, drinking plenty of fluids, and practicing mindfulness or whatever helps you stay centered and grounded. If needed, here are links to helplines and hotlines that these are also listed on Learning Institute website. So please feel free to refer yourself if need be. Our SAMHSA-funded MHCTC network focuses on technology transfers, which means the adoption and implementation of evidence-based practices for mental health across the United States and its territories. We develop and disseminate resources and provide free local and regional trainings and technical assistances for mental health workforces. Here is a lovely map that displays data centers throughout the United States and its regions. We have 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaska Native Center, and a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. Please visit our website or find your center so you may stay up to date on trainings and resources offered in your region. A brief disclaimer: this presentation was prepared by the MHCTC network under the cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in this presentation are the views of our speakers and do not reflect the official opinion of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. Now, with these introductions, I would like to present to you our excellent presenters that we have today, Dr. Daris Orovich and Dr. Salvador Treviño.
Sí, cómo no. My name is Salvador Treviño, and I'm a clinical psychologist as well as a marriage and family therapist. I've been involved in the field of professional psychology for a little over 40 years. I'm the executive director of Guadalupe Counseling and Psychological Services in Santa Barbara, California. I teach, I supervise, I train doctoral students in clinical psychology at Antioch University. And that is where my setting is academically. Professionally, it's with GCAPS at Guadalupe Counseling and Psychological Services. I'm going to present today, and I look forward to talking about my conceptualizations of what I see going on with the Latino community during this pandemic, during these very interesting times that we live in. Thank you for having me here.
Dr. Orovich is having some issues. She's just connecting back with us. So perhaps we could just move forward with Dr. Treviño, and she will come back with us in a few minutes.
Sí, cómo no, con mucho gusto. This hour and a half that we have for presenting is going to go by very, very fast. So I just want to make sure that I approach two key concepts before we move on, before I start presenting the actual presentation. And the first concept that I want to alert the participants is the concept of sacred space. And the term sacred space is known by several other names. It's referred to as temenos if you're a Jungian psychologist. It's referred to as the potential space, the transitional space, if you are an analytically oriented psychotherapist. It is the connection that we have with our patients when we're doing telemedicine. It is the private space that is established when the psychologist or the clinician closes the door in their office to create privacy. That sacred space is also referred to as the therapeutic alliance. And it is that therapeutic alliance that truly is the agent of change when we are working with any of our patients. It doesn't necessarily, I'm not necessarily referring to working only with Latino patients, but that sacred space is where a lot of the emotional dynamics are approached and hosted. There it is that place where that psychological dynamic is explored. But a key characteristic of sacred space, a key characteristic of that healing space that is psychotherapy, or that is that connection between us as clinicians and our clients and our patients, that connection is a space of transformation. And it is the sine qua non of any type of restoration of the soul. Anytime there is a loss, that sacred space, that therapeutic alliance, that emotional space, that psychological space, that relationship that is heartfelt, that's the true agent of change. And phenomenologically speaking, it is based on the lived experiences of our patients. If I want to know what my patient is going through, I'm going to ask them. That is the qualitative approach to my conceptualizations and what I will be presenting today. Let me know if if you guys have any questions here. Okay. Okay. The sacred space is naturally occurring. Sacred space is the womb. It's otherwise known as the matrix. Okay? It is that special containment where our patients discuss, identify the multiple losses that they have been experiencing during the pandemic. Okay? And so this is a key concept here. We're also going to be talking about some basic therapeutic approaches to working with the loss, a sense of loss with our Latino patients. And we will cover several descriptors of losses. Loss is not just a one-dimensional experience, but it is a multiplicity of conceptualizations, of experiences that I think as clinicians we need to understand. There are several learning objectives that we want to make sure that we want you to walk away with. And that is, the number one is to identify some cultural values that may be present in the grieving process. Now, grieving is the physical sensation of loss. Mourning is the public display of loss. So we'll be going over some of the cultural values of what it means to grieve and what it means to mourn during the pandemic. We're also going to help the participants name multiple losses that are currently being experienced by Latinos in the pandemic. To begin with, there is a loss of the employment, if that is the case. But a more significant loss that I see in our community, in the Latino community, is the loss that is allowed by the social distancing. Latinos are sociocentric in nature. We are relational in nature. You will see that when we meet someone, automatically sale el abrazo, un beso, un piquete, como decía mi mamá, a kiss on the cheek, the hugging. That has now been temporarily suspended. We are told, in order for you to be healthy and to be safe during the pandemic, you need to practice social distancing. That goes to the core of the sociocentricity of the Latino culture. We're also going to have, going to be discussing some activities that build relationships from the loss, to heal from the loss. So we're going to introduce some actual practical interventions. We're going to conceptualize the culturally sensitive treatment to working with the Latinos who have experienced loss. So we want you to walk away with some practical knowledge, something that you can use now. Okay. Next slide, please. This is our presentation outline. We want to briefly go over some statistics just to kind of get a sense of who we are discussing. We're also going to be going over very briefly the theoretical, philosophical knowledge base of our presentation. There is a dialectic tension that we hold between empirical science, the empiricism, the behavioral, cognitive behavioral approaches, and the qualitative approaches, the phenomenological approaches that are based on the lived experiences. I would suggest that as clinicians, we need to hold the tension between the empirical science and the phenomenological sciences. The phenomenological sciences looks at, once again, the lived experiences. It looks at the idea that there is not one universal truth, but a multiplicity of truths that changes meaning over time, versus the empirical science that looks for one universal truth, where there is one meaning. We try to hold the tension between the two. Each side, each scientific approach has its merits and it has its limitations. So this is a reason why we hold the tension between the two approaches. My training is that of a phenomenological clinical psychologist. We're going to be covering key concepts such as loss, grief, and ritual. The loss of ritual, the loss of the meaning of grief, the way we experience loss is being challenged right now because of the pandemic. Our traditions have to change if we are to remain healthy and see the other side of this pandemic. This is what we are told. We'll talk about some treatment considerations and we will summarize our presentation. Okay. Next slide, please. 60.6 million Latinos in the US. That is a sizable portion of the American population. American Indians are 5 times higher than whites to contract COVID-19. That's alarming. African Americans, 4.5% higher than our white friends, our white allies, our white compadres. That's pretty high. Latinos are 4 times higher than whites to come down with COVID-19. It's obvious that the communities of color are taking a major hit with this pandemic. 61% say that they know someone who has lost a job. Okay? 61%. That's very high. So you can just imagine the psychological stressors, the psychosocial stressors that are impacting communities of color because of this pandemic. Okay? This is who we're talking about. This is who Dr. Orovich and I are seeing in practice. Next slide, please.
So I apologize for the technical difficulties. We're back. So thank you, Dr. Treviño, for taking over. I appreciate it. So part of the knowledge base that we want to present to you today includes our theoretical and philosophical knowledge base, includes various concepts. To begin with, a person is the expert of his or her own lived experience. So the subjective experience of the individual is really what we're working with. Meaning is created through lived experiences. So it is the meaning that individuals give to those experiences that allow us to enter into those experiences again and work with them. And also knowledge can be constructed by listening to individuals describe what they live. So for example, I don't know if you heard me, but in the beginning I mentioned that most of my clinical experience comes from working with survivors of sexual violence. And one of the things that I noticed is that sometimes people refer to themselves as victims and sometimes as survivors, so that lets me know where they're at psychologically in the process. So keeping in mind some of the words that individuals use to describe themselves and their experiences is really important in the work that we do. Thinking of our populations, Latinos, so we know that there are various ways to describe ourselves, so that we listen to that as well. In terms of identity, am I Latino, am I Hispanic, am I Latinx? So these are some of the things that we listen to when we're working with our populations. Next slide. So some of the concepts, and I know Dr. Treviño already mentioned some of this in the introductions, some of the concepts that we're going to be discussing today include, that are related to the experiences that we're working with today, include loss, and loss results from death. It results from an experience of divorce. It may result from the ending of a relationship that is significant, or maybe even traumatic. And then grief is the internal subjective experience of such a loss. And grief, we'll see that it's all encompassing, and it may affect the way that we think, the way that we behave, and the way that we feel. So this response is going to vary. The response of grief is going to vary according to attachment styles. It's going to vary according to the type of relationship we had with the individual that we lost, or the person that we lost. It's also gonna vary according to the way that the loss happened, and of course, culture. And then mourning is the way that we express this grief. So again, it's going to have a lot to do with the way that we are, and it's going to have a lot to do with our spiritual beliefs and, of course, culture. And in mourning, rituals are an important and significant way to express grief. And what we have found is that during the pandemic, we have lost a lot of the rituals that we typically use to go through the process of grief and mourning. And then bereavement is a collective experience of loss. And as we know, during the pandemic, we've all been so exposed to death and the possibility of death and the death of others. And I think that it is a unique experience in that not only our clients are going through it, but we are as well. And that may take a different meaning. So next slide. Angel, can we go to the next one? Thank you. There we go. So today we are presenting two models that are consistent with our theoretical base. And this is the dual process model and the task-based model. And we're going to be speaking a little bit on how, what things to consider when we're working with Latino populations who are in grief processes. So the dual process model views bereavement as something that is defined by two orientations. So we have the loss orientation and the restoration orientation. And I know that Dr. Cerviño was speaking about the tensions, and I think that that's relevant here as well. So we may find that an individual may lean more towards the loss orientation, and that's the expression of the grief. You may find that they express sadness, that they cry, that they feel maybe disoriented, and then the restoration orientation considers the secondary stressors that result from the loss and how we adjust to those. So it's learning to live without the physical presence of the loved one, for example. And then in the therapy process, it is important that oscillation between these two orientations happen. And what may result the best is that for the therapy process to move, we want to allow both orientations to take place in a balanced and flexible manner, right? So we recognize that there's gonna be a oscillation towards loss and also towards restoration. If there's movement to one extreme or the other, we may find that it may result in such things as traumatic grief, right? Where the individual finds difficulty moving from one of those orientations. So for the therapist, the adaptive regulatory function is going to be finding both orientations in a balanced and flexible manner. And then the task-based model, you see that it establishes the core tasks that include accepting the reality of the loss, processing pain and grief, adjusting to a world without the deceased, and finding connection with that person. So you'll find that they're similar in that the third task in the task-based model is similar to the restoration orientation, and then the other three may be similar to the loss orientation. And I want to say a few things about the model. There are certain things that they take into consideration that are important to consider when working with Latino populations. Most of them consider the importance of meaning making, and we know that for some people, resignifying the relationship seems to have a healing effect on individuals. So it is part of the adaptation to loss. And then both models recognize that when there's a traumatic loss, a loss that wasn't expected, which is something that we may be experiencing now. We have individuals who are young, who may be healthy, who we weren't expecting to have difficulties, and maybe have difficulties resulting from COVID. So that may result in a traumatic loss experience. And this is challenging because it breaks some of the basic concepts that we have a lot about life and death. And that is important to work through as well. Another concept that not yet. Another concept that I want to mention has to do with continuing bonds. And it is, as I was mentioning earlier, it is the way that we resignify these relationships and how we maintain contact with the deceased one in a different manner. And for Latino populations who recognize the value of such relationships, we even have some rituals recognizing them. This is very important. And then we've all heard the axiom that it is the relationship that heals, and this is no less true for grief processing or grief therapy. So where there's a need for a caring individual who's stable, who's accepting, and who provides a safe space for the mourning and for the grief to take place. So it is a very sacred relationship, like Dr. Trevino was saying. So providing an encounter with a compassionate and empathically attuned individual is really going to provide the space for the healing to occur and the emotions to move. It's important to be understood and to be supported in their loss journey. And it is allowing the experience, the internal experience that we were mentioning earlier, the internal subjective experience, to become aware of those internal experiences and the inner reactions. That's the organismic valuing process with these models. And I want to mention that with Latino clients who've already been exposed to loss that may result from immigration, we recognize that there's a previous history of loss, maybe even traumatic loss. Because with immigration processes, we find the loss of culture, the loss of language, the loss of family, sometimes the loss of traditions. So moving to another country implicates that we work through the losses, and the restoration phase, or the restoration orientation, like we were mentioning, we give new meanings. And sometimes we incorporate new values and new ways of behaving. And it also may result in distrust in the therapeutic relationship. And this is also something we want to be aware of, and that we want to be able to provide a space to even talk about this, of course, to talk about this, and to find ways to increase trust in the therapeutic process. And this process is going to begin with ourselves, looking at ourselves, where we're at with experiences of loss and with the experiences of Latino populations. So next slide. Okay. Thank you, Manuel. So Dr. Trevino mentioned some of this when he spoke about how Latinos are 4 times higher, more likely to be infected by COVID-19. And some of the losses that Latinos have been experiencing throughout the pandemic include salaries and wages, death rates, access. Already access was difficult, and now it's even more difficult. For Latinos who don't have the technology to do telemedicine, access is even more complicated. Housing, sense of security, safety, traditional mourning rituals like we mentioned, right? And then ways of socializing and creating community. I was talking to Dr. Trevino when we were preparing for this webinar, and I was telling him how I've had a lot of clients recently who've experienced loss. And of course we expect this, but it's been increasing significantly. And one of the things that some of my clients have been having difficulty with are things like not being able to have an open casket. So this further complicates the mourning process. And as one client was saying, I don't accept it. I haven't seen him in the casket, so this hasn't happened, right? So current losses will also connect us to previous losses. And so that's one of the aspects that we've been exploring. So what has helped you in the past? And she was saying how looking at pictures was one way to reconnect with the lost person, and how that was being helpful as well. Next slide. So again, when we were preparing for the presentation, I remember Dr. Trevino asked me, so what are some of the things that you heard while working during the pandemic? And these are a few. Me hace falta abrazar, I miss hugging. He tenido asma la última semana, y mi médico dice que es emocional. I've had asthma in the last week, and my doctor says it's emotional. No puedo dormir. Something that I hear a lot in Puerto Rico is no me puedo quedar. And it is this idea that if I complain, I don't recognize the pain of others. But you can actually do both things, right? You can recognize your own and recognize that of others, the experiences of others. And another one, no sé cómo saludarte. So even greeting someone becomes complicated. She was telling me how she saw her friend and they were both wearing masks, and since we usually kiss each other on the cheek, she was like, I don't even know how to say hi to you. So ways of connecting are becoming different. Let me see. Yeah, so those are some of the expressions of grief among our Latino clients. Now, on our next slide, we're going to see how it is important to consider culture when we work with Latino clients, right? So we've been mentioning some of the particularities that are important when we're treating Latino clients, and this include the immigration process. This includes, so when we speak about immigration, we also have to consider acculturation and acculturative stress as we move to a new country and we begin to explore this new culture. That means that we sometimes negotiate some of the things that we do and how we do it to have a sense of belonging. And for some people that may be being bicultural, for some people it may be something different. So for some people it may be just adopting the practices and values of the host culture. So we recognize that and we explore it in our processes as well. What are some of the values that are important to consider when working with Latinos in grief and grief? So these values, fatalismo, espiritismo, have a lot to do with death, dying, and living. So fatalismo is the belief that control is external. So if we think about loss and grief, that means that there's a particular meaning that's going to be given to that experience based on that value. And then espiritismo is a way to connect with the dead, to have some sort of effect on your life, on your current life. So this is more common among Caribbean cultures. And again, this is a value of practice, a spiritual practice that has a lot to do with that. And then familismo, prioritizing the family needs, it includes many things. Family is viewed as more than the nuclear family. It includes grandparents, uncles, compadres, neighbors, friends. It means that boundaries are flexible between family members. It means a sense of interdependence. And it also means that there is really a priority given to the needs of your family members. So to give an example, again, thinking of grief processes, I had a client recently who was saying, I don't cry in front of my mother, right? So that meant that for that person, what that meant was that she was prioritizing the need for her mom to have a space where she felt calm, and if she needed to cry, then she wouldn't do it in front of her. So that value has a direct impact on the way that we're going to process loss and in the way that we grieve. She's not going to grieve in front of her mom. That's not going to happen. She's protecting her. That's what it means to her. And then confianza, which is trust. We mentioned it previously, how immigration processes and some anti-immigration policies may prevent some individuals from seeking help in the first place. And then when they do seek help, it is important to really explore the way they view the therapeutic process and if there are issues related to trust, so that those can be worked on in the relationship. And I think that leaves us with Salvador. Next slide, Angel. Thank you, Angel. So now I'll leave you with Dr. Salvador Trevino, and then we'll regroup for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Orbich. I just want to add a couple of things to what was said. And I want to highlight what Dr. Orbich said, and that is that the previous losses are activated, especially if they're traumatic losses. And that means that when a person loses their job because of pandemic, because of the fear of COVID-19, that loss is going to be significant. And that the significance of that loss is going to trigger and pull the previous losses in one's life. So as a result of what you see is an overwhelming reaction to what's going on right now. And as a clinician, we need to understand the depth of that reaction and to understand that it is historical in some ways. It is intergenerational, and the intergenerational trauma of Latinos and communities of color is activated with the current pandemic. So that is something that I just wanted to follow up on. The other notion is spirituality. What do we mean by spirituality? The idea that something in this universe is bigger than us. That's what I mean by spirituality, not necessarily referring to a religious belief, but one of a spiritual belief, one in the accepting the idea with profound humility that we are just one aspect of this great universe. Okay, Latinos are magnificent in tapping into their spirituality, and it taps into the positive side of fatalismo, of fatalism. The positive side, the higher functioning side of fatalismo is resilience. And I want to give you an example of fatalistic statements that our patients make. Cuando pasó esta cosa con COVID-19, mis pacientes me decían, pues si no hay otra vida, doctor Treviño, there's no other life. Así es la vida de la gente pobre. These are fatalistic statements, ¿no? Pues así es, no hay otra. There's no other way of living but to suffer. Okay? Eso es fatalismo. And I just want to throw out a conceptualization of fatalism. Why that is so, that seems to be such a significant part of the psychological makeup of Latinos. And it's tied into La Conquista. It's tied into what happened to the First Nation cultures when the Europeans first arrived. Fatalismo was born from there, and it's still very much active in our historical psychological makeup. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight those two things. The next slide, please. Okay. There are two things. There are two approaches or two paradigms that I hold again when I meet with my patients around significant losses. And currently, we're talking about the losses that have been triggered by the stay-at-home orders. But the First Nation paradigms, the First Nation way of looking at things, the indigenous way of looking at things endorses the belief that a person heals best in the conditions that they have experienced. Thus, the place of isolation, stay at home, becomes a sacred space for healing. Thus, the value of telemedicine or distant counseling. For those of us who went to graduate school, that's all we were taught is the private practice office, the private practice model. Even when we were training in practica, we had that goal in mind that once the training is over and we get licensed, we're going to have a private practice and we're going to have an office. Now that sacred space has now been challenged because of the stay-at-home order. We are now relying on technology to help create a very special relationship, the therapeutic alliance, which is very, very challenging. Okay? But we need to keep that in mind, that this is what heals. This is what works. It is a phenomenological, it is an experiential and qualitative way of creating that sacred space to heal our patients. The next slide, please. There are several techniques that we all already do in our personal lives and also in our professional lives. And I want to highlight this, and that is the value of catharsis. Catharsis appears to be a universal healing agent found across all cultures, all traditions. And a very quick sidebar here, when we are talking about culture, we are talking about traditions. The traditions of the way we learn in our families how to be in this world, the traditions of salutations, the traditions of saying goodbye, the traditions that give meaning to illnesses, the traditions that give meaning to health and treatment for those illnesses, okay? This is culture. This is what we are referring to, okay? Catharsis is culturally based. A person who has the confidence in the sacred space of psychotherapy, who has the confidence that the therapist that they are talking to has the experience, has the knowledge, and has the credibility, and in all likelihood that patient is going to allow themselves to feel those emotions and to express them in a cathartic dynamic, okay? Now, that catharsis should lead to a corrective emotional experience. Healing for Latinos is an emotional experience. If the emotional experience is positive, that is based on spirituality, that is based on the notion of resilience and fatalismo, there's nothing about this illness. We can't do anything about this illness other than to wear our masks, to stay away from each other, okay? That fatalismo of this illness is an emotional reaction that creates meaning. That meaning needs to be changed, thus the corrective emotional experience, okay? The corrective emotional experience has always been the core of the Latino family. Dime lo que sientes, mijo. Y el muchacho comienza a llorar con la mamá, platicando de lo que siente en el corazón. The mother just listens, bears witness to the son's suffering. The suffering is dissipated. It's reduced. And the child feels more connected to the mother for telling them what they were experiencing. That is a corrective emotional experience that we do in psychotherapy as well. Next slide, please. Latinos are sociocentric. The Mediterranean culture is sociocentric. The indigenous cultures are sociocentric. Most of the world, the Asians, are sociocentric. We believe in relationships. The sociocentricity of the Latino culture, okay, is right now wounded because of what we are being told. Stay away from each other. Wear your mask. Stay at least 6 feet away from one another. That's very hard for Latinos. We understand that. We understand the scientific reasoning. We understand the empiricism of these orders that they're having us do. Wear your mask, stay away. We understand that. But it still goes against our traditions of the sociocentric nature, that we are family oriented. We are relationally oriented. Now, the power of the family also is the medicine that heals the wounds, the psychosocial emotional stresses of the pandemic. It is the relational dynamic. It is the bearing witness to our family. It is the mother asking the child, ¿Qué tienes, mijo? It is the father asking the daughter, pues así va a ser. Nos vamos a cuidar muy bien. Tienes que cooperar. That sociocentric nature is the power of the relationship. It is also the core, the sine qua non of the therapeutic relationship. It is what heals. Science tells us it is not the theory, it is not the techniques of a particular theory that heals and transforms. It is the qualitative relationship, the therapeutic alliance that really is the true agent of change. Just think about the clinicians or the psychologist or the person that you prefer to talk to about your problems. What is it about that person that draws you to them? It is the therapeutic relationship. It es lo que tienes en tu corazón that makes me come back. My patient tells me, I went to see Dr. Corral after my divorce. Why did you go see her? There is something about her. I don't know what, but she never made me feel stupid because I wanted to divorce. She never made me feel ridiculous because I was afraid of catching COVID-19. She never made me feel like this. She never made me feel like that. She let me just speak my heart. Okay, now that's a therapeutic relationship. You can imagine the corrective emotional experiences that occurred in that therapeutic relationship, okay? Latinos are social-centric. The stay at home, social distancing is another wounding that needs to be attended to in counseling. Next slide, please. The power of rituals. Okay? When you would see your patients, when you see your clients, when they first step into your office, you say hello, you shake your hands. There is an element of personalismo. ¿Cómo le va? ¿Cómo le ha ido? ¿Cómo está en el trabajo? Ahorita hay bastante trabajo. Sí, ahorita mucho. Just the regular chit chat is a ritual that carries a lot of cultural significance and establishes the therapeutic alliance. When we are connecting with our patients through teleconferencing, through distance counseling, that ritual needs to be restored. The idea that we are now talking to someone electronically and not in person is a change in our tradition as Latinos. That tradition, that ritualistic tradition of personalismo before and after we meet has to be restored. The loss of ritual, saludos, abrazos, adds to the loss, adds to the collective depression that we are seeing in the Latino community in response to the pandemic. Next slide, please. Las pláticas sagradas. That's what one of my patients used to call the psychotherapy. Pues aquí vengo con las pláticas sagradas. Okay. Sacred space is where community ritual and sacred talks are combined to promote psychological and physical healing. Therapy is the sacred talk. It is la plática sagrada that needs to be restored, that needs to be maintained through teleconferencing. Pláticas sagradas take place in our virtual and real offices. These spaces are conceptualized as sacred space. Next slide, please. Creating meaning is governed by culture. Creating meaning is governed by our traditions. Creating meaning is directly related to what you experienced in your family. You learn to give meaning to losses. You learn to give meaning to events. You learn to give meaning to symptoms from your family. Your family is the courier of cultural traditions. We need to understand that. Next slide, please. In growing up on the way out, if you had to go to school, if you're leaving for work, or ahorita vengo voy a un mandado, my mother would say. Before leaving the house, everyone stopped by the altar of Guadalupe, you blessed yourself, you said a prayer, a particular specialized prayer because of what lies ahead of you for that day, and then you left. You left protected. It is a ritual that gives meaning, a ritual that preserves meaning, a ritual that gives security. It is ritualistic. It is a containment of everything that is important for us. Rituals. The loss of rituals is a significant loss, and it is a disconnect from your culture. The conceptualization is this: whenever we disconnect from our traditions, we become symptomatic. That's a conceptualization, okay? I want to come back to that. When we returned from being on the outside, we were always expected to stop by the altar and to give gratitude to Guadalupe for watching you throughout the day and for you to come home. Rituals. We shake hands. We say, buenas tardes, ¿cómo le va? Pase por favor, acomódese bien. When it's time to go, bueno, hasta la semana que entra, aquí me voy a despedir, que le vaya bien. Those ritualistic beginnings and ends, I want to ask you to be mindful of that. It restores our traditions. Next slide, please. We have to maintain the tension. This is for me. I maintain the tension, as I said before, between the empirical approaches and the qualitative approaches, the phenomenological approaches. I need to be connected to the empirical approaches because scientific fact is very important to me. I need to understand what is the treatment choices for depression, for anxiety. I need to understand when there is an appropriate referral to a psychiatrist for a medication evaluation. I need to understand and see that there is value to medication, that there is value to psychological testing, that there is value to cognitive behavioral therapy. But as I said before, there are limitations to that. Okay? Most of the world, most of my patients do not go around living in this world from a cognitive behavioral perspective. They live in this world from a phenomenological qualitative perspective, where meanings change day to day, where there are multiplicity of truths day to day, where illnesses are not just caused by biological reasons, but psychopathology are sometimes caused by experiential causes, by metaphysical causes, by the non-linear way of looking at things. I need to hold the tension between those two approaches if I am to succeed as a psychologist, as a clinician working in the Latino community. Okay. Next slide, please. Again, I wanna emphasize this. I want to recap this, and that is that the sine qua non of any therapeutic change, of any restoration of the soul because of the laws, the sine qua non, okay, is the therapeutic alliance, is the ability to articulate a shared worldview of illnesses and symptoms, the use of metaphor, the use of ritual. When your patient tells you, pues me enfermé, ¿por qué se enfermó? Pues ahí andaba sudando la gota gorda. We need to understand that those are the expressions that our patients bring to us to let us know what their symptoms are. Establishing the credibility of the clinician as a knowledgeable, empathic healer who speaks the same language, who understands the nuances of traditions, the shared lived experiences of being a Latino, of being a Latina in contemporary society. It's essential that we have some understanding of that. The installation of hope in client expectations of psychotherapy is a true agent of change. When we see our patients through the computer, through telemedicine, on the phone, we need to be very, very careful and take that extra step that we are still installing hope. We are still trying to create hope. And one of the easiest ways of approaching to create hope is to support and reinforce your patient for calling out to you, for looking at their situation, trying to solve it as much as they can. And when they realize I may need some extra help, they found your phone number, they tracked you down. Now that's hope. And we want to reinforce that. Finally, specific cultural sensitive responsive interventions are conceptualized through spirituality, prayer, and pláticas sagradas. Okay? I want you to consider that this is how I'm conceptualizing this. Okay? When my patient tells me, pues este muchacho ya está teniendo problemas en la escuela, ya se mortifica porque ya no quiere ir a la escuela, complaining about online learning. What do you tell them? How do you create hope? How do you try to understand the nuances of what the mother is seeing, of what the child is complaining about? Okay? When the psychologist responds to, pues, si no hay otra ahorita, no, ¿a poco no? You are using the spirituality that something is bigger than us, and there's no other way of approaching this by taking it, unless we take it one step at a time, breaking it down into bite-sized pieces, creating hope. Aquí me voy a quedar because I think I've ran out of time, and I want to open it up to questions. I want to hook in my colleague, Dr. Orovich, and we can take it from here. We can answer any questions, talk about any cases you may want to talk about, as long as they are de-identified.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Trevino. Here's Dr. Orovich, so you can start answering questions as you like.
I'm going to go ahead. Can everyone hear me? I'm concerned that you're not going to be able to hear me. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Okay,
we're having yeses in the chat box.
Okay, perfect. So I saw one question that was being asked, I think more than once, and I want to go over that. And that was the difference between grief and mourning. And as we mentioned, grief is the internal subjective experience of loss, how we experience it within us, and then mourning is how we express it outwards. So I mentioned before that the integration and expression of such grief may be determined by different factors, including the nature of the relationship, the way the loss happened, and of course culture. So that may mean that an expression, for example, is crying, an expression may be screaming, for some cultures fainting. So that is the difference. I hope that helps with the question. If not, let me know. Also, Dr. Trevino, there is a question regarding translation of some of the concepts, including grief, mourning, and bereavement. So if I have that for grief, it would be dolor, and then mourning would be luto or duelo, and then bereavement would be luto, and mourning would be duelo. Let me know if you have other words that might be helpful for participants, or if you want to add to
that. That's correct. I want to add some of the actual expressions of grief, the swelling of your eyes with tears, the sudden reaction of your breath being taken away, el puñalazo en el corazón, grief, pues me rompe el corazón cuando me habla así, grief. Okay. The public display of that grief, as Dr. Orovich would say, the expression of that grief. A common occurrence with our patients is they cover themselves, they cover their face cuando están llorando. Expressions of shame for their grief. You're looking at me, somebody is witnessing. Now that person has been taught to be ashamed of their grief and be ashamed of mourning, of letting other people know. it becomes important for us to give permission to our patients to cry, give them permission to experience that grief. Now,
sometimes there's even an apology.
Sí.
Right? Sometimes it comes with an apology, and then
Sí, cómo no?
you're able to validate the expression of grief.
I had this one patient pull a Kleenex out of the box. One square, just one square. And for the entire hour, that's all she used to wipe away her tears. And that square of that Kleenex was getting smaller and smaller and smaller as she was folding the Kleenex to wipe away her tears. Cuando le dije, aquí tengo más, help yourself. She tells me, no estoy muy bien, no necesito más, porque ya paré de llorar. Keep in mind that she was still crying when she said that. Okay. Now that morning, that expression of grief was shame-based. She was ashamed of that, and that's a learned behavior. So as a clinician, I needed to give her permission. I also needed to be very much aware of my own grief reactions to seeing her react to the loss. That's the basis of the understanding. That's the basis of the therapeutic alliance.
Dr. Treviños and Dr. Orovich, we have a question here that it comes up. It says, one second, I move. Okay, do you feel a non-Spanish speaking therapist can be helpful in the grieving process of Latino populations? That's the question that we have.
Sí.
Definitely yes. The short answer is yes. But that means that therapist is willing and open to learn about the culture of the Latino client, maybe even willing to learn some of the language. We mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, individuals are the expert of their own experiences, so they have the expert on the culture right in front of them. So being able and being willing and open to learn about the culture will definitely provide a safe space for exploration and for the installation of hope that's so important that Dr. Treviño was mentioning. If you want to add to that.
See, I too am a believer that you can help someone if you don't know the language, if you're not fluent in Spanish. I will say that you need to know some elements of expression, some element of how your patient expresses illness, of how your patient expresses health, of how your patient gives meaning. So some understanding of metaphors. I'm not saying become a UN court certified interpreter. I'm not saying that, but you need to have some familiarity with the language because it is the language through which a lot of communication is expressed or is completed. Okay, so
can I add something to that?
yes, yes.
We have a collaborator that Dr. Treviño actually referred to us, Dr. Emily Maynard, and she's a therapist that has been treating Latino clients, and she's learned the language and done other things. But one of the things that we speak about when we speak about non-Spanish speaking therapists is maybe allow the client to express the emotion in their native language, even if you don't understand it, to see the emotion that is attached to that expression, and then explore meanings of what was being said and what was being expressed. So that's one option as well.
We have another, yeah, Dr. Treviño.
One quick point on that. The other thing that you can do if you're working with someone from another culture is to attend to the universal need to seek help. When your patient calls you, tracks you down and calls you, reinforce that need for help. support and reinforce that they made good choices in calling you, that they made good choices in tracking you down. If not you, someone else. So speak to the universal language of wanting to feel better. Speak to the universal language of looking for someone that may know something a little bit more that can help you. These are the natural curative universal factors that we find with clinicians who are doing cross-cultural counseling. Okay. Thank you.
Our next question was, how do you suggest we help build or create that hope? So I think that what you just mentioned helps us a little bit with that part. I don't know if you want to say something else.
I want to add one more thing, and that is that wherever you're practicing your craft, your healing art, okay, make your environment culturally responsive to the patients that you're working with. Have something in your office, have something in your background that your patient can relate to. Anything that looks like me, when I go to my therapist, anything that looks like me, anything, automatically establishes a therapeutic alliance.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Trevino. I have another great question here, and it pertains about suicide. And it says, what is the cultural influence of how suicide is viewed, and how do you support Latino patients that experience loss by suicide?
Dr. Orovich?
Could you mention the last part again? I have an idea of what I want to say, but
yes, I'll read it once again. What is the cultural influence of how suicide is viewed, and how do you support Latino patients that experience loss by suicide? It's quite a complex question, yeah.
I think that a key point here is the value of spirituality and religion. And it goes in different directions. So that is a value that you definitely want to explore and you want to incorporate into treatment. What has been mostly found is that spirituality is a protective factor for suicidal behavior. So when you ask clients, what is something that is stopping you from actually doing some of the things that you're thinking about, for example, hurting yourself, you'll find that time and again they'll say, well, God, I believe that God doesn't view this as a way out, so that's one thing. Family is the other important protective factor. You'll find that most individuals will say, I don't want to hurt my family members. And we mentioned earlier how one of the manifestations of familismo is putting the needs of family members over our own. So familismo is another important aspect to consider. And I think this question also has to do with the fact that it has been said that spirituality has viewed suicide as something to be punished, or death by suicide, I should say, something to be punished, something to be ashamed of, and then that adds another layer of complexity to the meaning of the experience for family members. So again, incorporating family and spirituality, I would say, would be really valuable.
I want to add to what Dr. Orovich said. Suicidality is not sanctioned by the Latino culture. It is not sanctioned as a legitimate, viable way of solving one's problems. Suicidality among the Latino culture is typically because of loss of meaning. It's an existential crisis. It becomes a way out. Okay? And I agree with Dr. Orovich. The presence of protective factors would help in resolving that despair and that loss of hope. Okay? For Latinos, loss of meaning is quite profound. Loss of role in the family, loss of love, loss of an offspring, quite profound. Loss of a spouse, two losses that are irrecoverable, that may contribute to suicidality. And that's a loss of an offspring and a loss of a spouse. Okay. The healing from loss because of suicidality would have the same elements as the healing, as the therapy for any significant loss due to death. There is the catharsis, there is the reconstruction of that loss, there is the corrective emotional experience. All of that goes to facilitating bereavement, going from a diagnosis of a complicated bereavement, secondary to suicidality, to one that facilitates the bereavement, the mourning, la limpieza del corazón, como decía mi mamá. ¿No? All of that is a restoring of the ritual that can be done through a ritual, which is psychotherapy, las pláticas sagradas.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Treviño. We have another great question over here pertaining telehealth services. And it says, could you give some tips on cultural sensitivity with Latinos in telehealth interactions?
Dr. Orovich?
Okay. So I think Dr. Treviño mentioned earlier something that is relevant regarding telehealth services, and one of the things is creating the space. Again, we have our backgrounds and we want to be able to share with our clients, even if it's virtually, some of the items and some of the symbols that represent the cultures that we work with. So that's one way to address that through telehealth. I think it's important to recognize some of the limitations of telehealth as well, and to be empathic to those experiences. We will find that at times the privacy may be a concern. I've seen individuals virtually who have to go to their closet because they don't have any other place to have a little more privacy, to have therapy, or to participate in the therapy process. So just to be aware that they're Latinos sometimes live with other family members, other generations, and we need to speak about some of these limitations. That's one thing. There are many others, but that's one thing to think about.
Before I start agree to see a patient through teleconferencing, I go over some of the ground rules that I think are important. And I tell this to my families. I see families online. I also see individuals. Excuse me. Seeing children is very challenging. Doing family therapy around parenting is very, very challenging. But we do the best. So these are some of the ground rules. I ask the parents to call me to begin the session in the same way that I would expect my patients to show up, knock on the door. Then I know that they're here. I come out and I greet them and I ask them to come in. So instead of the knock on the door, I expect my patients to call me. I'm waiting for your call. If they don't call me, I wait for the 20 minutes, sometimes up to 30 minutes that I typically do to make sure that everything is okay, before I then consider that there was a no-show. But I call them at least once to make sure everything is okay, in the same way that I would do when I was seeing my patients in person, okay? I also ask my patients, my families, the parents, not to call me to start their teleconferencing session while they're driving. Some of my patients are so, their plate is so full that they're taking care of everything all at once, including attending their appointments through teleconferencing, but they're doing it as they're driving. I ask them not to call me, not to have the sessions while they're washing their dishes. I ask them not to call me while they're shopping at Costco. I ask them not to call me when company is over. I ask them not to call me while they're laying down in bed. les digo, necesito que tener una plática en un lugar cuando todos estamos, cuando la cosa está privada, señora. Señor, necesito que hagas tú esa cosa para, quiero que no me llame cuando están manejando, porque eso es un peligro muy grande. I have to get down to that basic. The other thing is when I need to talk to the parents privately, when it revolves around the marriage and not so much parenthood, I ask them, I need to speak with you privately. Necesito que tener esta plática privada. ¿Le da permiso a su hijo salir del cuarto? I ask for the children to leave. I get down to this basic because it is a different type of modality if you're not used to that. It's not a phone call. It's not something that you can call your therapist and talk about deeply personal stuff when someone else is in the room. I also ask them not to call me during dinner time. Sometimes I'll get calls as they're about to sit down and eat because I'd rather talk to you and eat than to sit here and just get anxious. So I set my parameters around the idea that this is a very focused, very private conversation that I need 100% of your attention. I don't need for you to endanger yourself in any way if you're calling me by driving or talking to me out in public, like Dr. Orbit said, where privacy is not guaranteed. So these are the things that I have to do to tailor and accommodate my patients.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Trevino and Dr. Orovich, for your great input. We have some short minutes for one last question. So there's great many questions in the Q&A. So I'm sorry that we can't get to them all in this time. But one of the last one I wanted to share with you is, how can clinicians approach conversations about self-care with clients while respecting values like familismo?
Dr. Orbich?
Okay. I think that you would do it as you would do it with other groups. If there's a result from practicing any value that has an emotional implication, if there's sadness, if there's anxiety, if there's anything that's resulting from that, you want to be able to address it. And familismo is an important value. It doesn't mean you could work on valuing family while maintaining boundaries. So that's one important aspect to consider. You can establish some boundaries with family members, and in actuality, sometimes Hispanic families have been seen as enmeshed, and that's not exact. I mean, there are some like any other culture, but that's not typical to the Hispanic or Latino family. Boundaries are flexible, like I mentioned, and there is a concept of interdependence. So that means that individuals rely on each other, but they don't fully depend on each other. So they're able to fluctuate between being independent and sharing some of their experiences. So I would say just to see what the emotional cost of practicing anything maybe that's not related exactly to familismo and has to do with something else. And then being able to take care of yourself, recognizing that it has an emotional cost.
I want to add to what Dr. Orvich said, and that is that in terms of self-care, I approach self-care as ritualistic. So I help my patients develop a ritual that will be consistent with the culture. For example, every morning, como me gusta allá en la mañana en el jardín. Me gusta, me gusta, me gusta. Every morning, that becomes a self-care ritual. Spend some time in the garden. Sometimes spend some time in the garden drinking your coffee. Sometimes it is spending time in the kitchen with your favorite coffee. Con un panecito, un tacito de café, tranquila. Okay, that becomes self-care. And food becomes ritualistic. Food and music. Put your favorite music on. as you're you're having your cup of coffee with your bread. Music is culturally anchored. It gives us relief. It creates movement, another cultural element for self-care. Okay? A lot of my patients that I see se cuidan porque tienen diabetes. ¿Y cómo se cuida? Pues después de que el desayuno voy a caminar. So movement, exercise becomes culturally sanctioned. The other is prayer. Every day, do some kind of prayer. Say some prayer. Doesn't have to be the traditional Catholic prayer. You can come up with your own prayer. Okay? The other thing, self-care, is humor. Humor is culturally defined. Okay? A lot of people enjoy listening to a comedian. So I'll ask my patients, who's your favorite comedian? If you're feeling a little bit down, go to YouTube and play some of that, some of the stuff that you enjoy listening to. Okay? So these are culturally sanctioned ways that I help my patients develop self-care. Most of my patients, when they come in to see me, they already have an established self-care that includes prayer. I reinforce that. I also want to make sure that my patients understand that they know their life better than I do, that what works for me may not work for you. And we start with accepting those differences. I hope that helps.
I was going to say, from what you were just saying, that it has to be consistent with the individual, their values and their experiences. So like you said, most people already know what works for them, and that's possibly related to their culture and their values. So,
when you hear culture, think of tradition.
That's excellent. Thank you, Dr. Orovic and Dr. Trevino, for answering all of those questions and giving an excellent presentation throughout this hour. Before we leave, sadly, like I mentioned, we have no more time for questions, but we want to refer you and ask you please to take a moment and complete the brief survey about today's session. Your feedback is very important to us, and you will be redirected to the survey when you go to some platform, or you can also access it to do the QR code on your screen or the presentation link. This always helps us a great deal with developing material that's appropriate to what the people want to hear. Also, we would like to refer you to our next session, that is the optional breakout discussions that will be happening right after this session. So please take an opportunity and move to those optional break rooms for discussion. And lastly, we would like to thank you once again for being here with us today and signing up for this excellent virtual learning institute. We want to remind you that we'll be having the second part of this institute in November, so make sure to stay tuned for that. And without anything more, thank you once again.